in this particular lecture with the liberal perspective. In fact, the liberal perspective is perhaps the most important perspective which we experience in our daily life. Because although we quite often use the expression modern state, but the modern state as we experience it in our daily life, the modern state which we encounter in our daily life, this modern state, for instance in India, well, this modern state is primarily the liberal state. Now, what exactly is the liberal understanding of this state, or what exactly is meant by the liberal variant of the modern state? The question becomes particularly important because this liberal perspective itself actually is not a homogeneous understanding. This liberal perspective has undergone many changes. This liberal perspective has witnessed many shifts, and therefore this liberal perspective we have to understand, we have to appreciate in the form of, or in the light of, the contending issues, in the light of the varieties, in the light of the variations which come under the general rubric, the liberal perspective. Now, how did the liberal state emerge? We have already seen, especially in our last lecture, that the modern state actually emerged out of the absolutist state. Now, the liberal state, or the liberal understanding, or the liberal perspective, it was actually a response to the absolutist state. The absolutist state, you will remember, it witnessed the rise of monarchical absolutism. And this monarchical absolutism at the same time witnessed, in fact, this happened when the age of feudalism was gradually coming to a close. Now, this monarchical absolutism witnessed, on the one hand, the rise of monarchy, the concentration of power in the hands of the monarch, and the birth of a very powerful, mighty state. Simultaneously, it also witnessed the rise of a new commercial class, which actually wanted the end of feudalism, which also demanded the rise of a powerful state, which will be dominated by one single sovereign. Now, what happened was, and this actually went into the making of the liberal state, what happened was that this new commercial class, it eventually felt that this very powerful, mighty, absolutist state was posing a threat to its own interests. New commercial class, it felt that two things are necessary in its own interest. First, a kind of understanding is necessary, a kind of perspective is required, which would cut down, which would curb the authority of this absolute state, or the authority of absolute monarchy. This is one. The other was free play of their commercial and business activities. That is, on the one hand, what they required was cutting down, curbing the authority of state, that is a kind of anti-statism, and the other thing that they demanded was freedom of the individual. Because the state itself, this powerful state itself, the absolutist state itself, was posing a threat to this rising commercial class. So this is actually what explains the origins of liberalism. And liberalism, the philosophy of liberalism, on the basis of which the liberal state was founded, it emerged in the 17th century, primarily in England, and that too basically in the doctrine of John Locke. Locke's focus on the doctrine of natural rights, which meant that rights to life, liberty and property, they are absolutely sacred, they cannot be interfered with by the state. Well, these have to be guaranteed by the state. That is, a state was necessary, not that the liberal state totally rejected the state. But for the liberals, in the understanding of liberalism, the state is necessary only because the state will have to protect the rights, these natural rights of the individual. This was the basic focus of liberalism. That is, the state is a kind of necessary evil. It is necessary only for the protection of natural rights, and one can very well understand these rights to life, liberty and property. Well, if these are treated as natural rights, this ultimately validates, almost in absolute terms, the right to acquire private property. So this is how liberalism emerged in the 17th century. And this led to, as Professor C.B. Macpherson has explained it beautifully, this led to, right from the very beginning, a kind of contradiction within liberalism itself. Now, what was the nature of this contradiction? On the one hand, liberalism claimed that all men, all individuals are equal in the eye of law. But since the individuals were placed not evenly in society, since some people were rich, some people were poor, and obviously the propertied class constitute the minority, the property-less class constitute the majority, so that led eventually to inequality. That is, on the one hand, you are talking of liberty, you are talking of freedom of the individual. On the other hand, you are also talking of equality. That is, although you are talking of equal rights of the individual, but the individuals were not placed equally in society. That is, it led to a kind of contradiction between the principle of liberty and the principle of equality. And this actually led to the beginning of a crisis in liberalism. Because as the liberal doctrine consolidated itself, it began in 17th century and then it developed throughout the 18th century and it reached a climax in the 19th century. So within a space of, say, 200 years, by the middle of the 19th century, liberalism reached a sort of crisis. Now, what was the crisis all about? The crisis refers to the growing inequality, and as against inequality, what happened in England, in France, and in many other countries of Europe, that is social protest, agitation, strike movements, etc. Because people gradually began to feel that they were victims of market. They were victims of forces unleashed by market. They were virtually helpless victims of those individuals. They were virtually victims of a situation which was primarily controlled by the propertied minority. And so that led to, broadly speaking, a climate of social unrest. And this social unrest climaxed into number of agitations, movements, revolts, etc., etc. So this is how the liberal state began to face a crisis. By the middle of the 19th century, so it began to be appreciated, it began to be felt by a number of theories on different levels that this doctrine of liberalism, which originally proclaimed the idea of a minimalist state, that is, the state's intervention will be minimum, that is, the state will not interfere with the natural rights of the individual. Well, this kind of doctrine will not do. This doctrine requires revision. And this revision actually originated at two levels. And these two levels we have to understand primarily with reference to the 19th century. On one level, in England, they developed the idea of the theory or the philosophy of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, it was associated with two very leading theorists or philosophers of England. One was Jeremy Bentham, the other was John Stuart Mill. Now, they actually revised and thereby questioned the doctrine of natural rights. In place of natural rights, which had its focus exclusively on the individual, the utilitarians, they proclaimed, they argued that no, individual is not our point of departure. The individual and his rights, they do not constitute our reference point. A theme, that was the motto of utilitarianism, that is greatest good of the greatest number. That is a policy, whether it will be acceptable or not, even if it is a policy that is initiated by the state. Suppose a policy which implies state intervention, suppose it's a policy which interferes with individual rights, well, that will be acceptable if it serves the interests of the collective. That is, if it is in the interest of, if it serves the cause of utility of all, that is, utility of the majority, then that sort of policy, that sort of state, well, this will be acceptable. So this was one argument, this was one understanding, this was a kind of perspective which challenged the natural rights doctrine of liberalism. The other doctrine, which was not very much influential in Britain, but still it made an impact on the revision of liberalism, this is a doctrine which was largely associated with a kind of philosophy which broadly is known as English idealism. This English idealist philosophy is associated with a very eminent British philosopher, T.H. Green. T.H. Green, primarily under the influence of Hegel and other German idealistic philosophers, he put forward the idea that in the interests of the collective, in fact, in the interests of individual freedom, it is necessary for the state to intervene. That is, Green's entire doctrine, it tried to put forward and thereby justify the importance of the state in the life of the individual. The essence of his argument was that there is no conflict between individual freedom and the intervention of the state. That is, the collective, it is necessary, it is significant, it is required to promote the life of the individual, to promote the freedom of the individual. So under the impact of these two doctrines, liberalism underwent a revision. By the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, we come across a major revision of liberalism, which came to be known as New Liberalism. This New Liberalism, it was associated with a number of scholars like L.T. Hobhouse, like Harold Lasky, and eventually it is this New Liberalism which also, especially in the 1930s, thanks to the contribution of the great economist J.M. Keynes, it gave rise to the doctrine of the welfare state. That is, the individual cannot be just left free in the sense that the individual should not be allowed to be a victim of market forces. In the interest of social justice, in the interest of social stability, in the interest of equity, there has to be a balance between individual freedom and state intervention. That is the original understanding of liberalism, that the state and the individual, their relations are relations of conflict. Doctrine of New Liberalism, associated with the philosophers, associated with the thinkers whom I have mentioned, well, they actually tried to argue, they actually tried to put forward the proposition that no, the individual and the state, they are not related, they are not relations of opposition. That is, they are not conflicting so far as these two entities are concerned. But this whole idea of welfareism, this idea of state intervention, which was the crux of new liberalism, this doctrine also, this understanding, this revised notion of liberalism also was faced with a challenge. It was faced with a challenge in the sense that of course, after the end of the Second World War, welfareism got a big booster. In fact, in a number of countries of Europe, in Britain, say in France, in Germany, in the Scandinavian countries, the welfarist model became quite popular. But by the 1970s, particularly in the sense that by the time of the late 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s, this notion of new liberalism, it came under attack. It began to be felt, it began to be argued by a number of people that the welfarist state, it ultimately did not deliver the goods. It did not deliver the goods because the welfarist model had given rise to a very big, monstrous state, all right. It gave rise to bureaucracy, all right. It gave rise to corruption, all right. But it could not solve the problem of unemployment. It could not solve the problem of economic growth. And therefore, this state has got to be downsized. That is, we have to go back to the original spirit of liberalism. That is the Lockean understanding of liberalism. That is, the state is a necessary evil. So, down with welfareism, out with this very big, powerful state. Well, that became the motto of a new understanding, new perspective of liberalism. This new notion of liberalism specially got a booster with the coming to power in the 1980s of Margaret Thatcher in Britain, Donald Reagan in the United States. What happened was that by the beginning of the 1980s, the end of the 1970s, we come across a new variety of liberalism which came to be known as neo-liberalism. And these two terms are actually not identical. One is new liberalism, which was associated with the first revision of liberalism, and this is neoliberalism, which is the second revision of liberalism. Neoliberalism primarily tried to resurrect, it tried to revive, as I have already mentioned, the original spirit of liberalism. That is, it tried to proclaim the idea of a minimalist state. And it primarily tried to espouse the idea of individual freedom to the exclusion of the state. Three writers, three philosophers are largely associated with this notion of neoliberalism or with this neoliberal doctrine of state. These three persons are, one is Friedrich Hayek of Germany, the other is Milton Friedman of the United States, and finally Robert Nozick. Now, so far as political science is concerned, political theory is concerned, it is Robert Nozick who is considered as the most outspoken champion of neoliberalism. Very briefly, Robert Nozick's understanding is this. His entire theory is primarily based on the defense of rights. He, first of all, argues that state intervention in the life of the individual, it is synonymous with interference with individual freedom. The state intervention, whatever be the context, whatever be the pretext, it is a necessary threat to individual freedom. And Robert Nozick's understanding is based on the premise that so far as liberalism is concerned, the liberal spirit, well, it is a spirit which primarily honors, which primarily sanctifies the spirit of individual freedom. So individual freedom to the exclusion of everything. and of course to the exclusion of state. That is the motto of Robert Nozick's understanding of what has come to be known as neoliberalism. Now, how does Robert Nozick develop his understanding or his perspective? Robert Nozick's understanding may broadly be interpreted or may broadly be viewed in terms of, first of all, his notion of the state of nature. He believes that so far as human beings are concerned, in the state of nature, well, they were otherwise quite able, they were quite capable of protecting their interests, protecting their rights. But without an agency, without a kind of institution, a sort of supervisory institution, if every individual looks for a private agency to honor, to defend, to protect their rights, that may lead to clash of the protective agencies. So, Robert Nozick's central understanding is this, that in the state of nature, people are primarily concerned with protection, defense of their rights, and for protection, for defense of their rights, well, these individuals look for a protective agency. But since there were multiple agencies, so you required ultimately a sort of coordinating agency, and that is why you required the state. That is, the state is necessary in order to safeguard, in order to protect, in order to ensure your enjoyment of rights. You can very well sense, you can very well guess that this is the original spirit of liberalism. That is, it is very close to Locke's understanding of natural rights, that rights are sacred, rights are absolute, rights are inviolable. And therefore, what you require is, what your agenda is, that how your rights can be safely protected. And for that, you require an agency. The state is nothing but simply a protective agency which is required for protection of individuals' rights. This is the main thesis of Robert Nozick. Then, Robert Nozick argues that so far as individuals' enjoyment of rights, well, this is concerned, you have to found your rights, or say you have to formulate your rights primarily on the basis of two principles of justice. Now, what are these two principles of justice? The first principle of justice is the principle of acquisition. Now, what is meant by this principle of acquisition? Robert Nozick's understanding is very simple. That if there are resources in society which stand unclaimed, that is, there is no claimant of those resources, then there is nothing wrong for an individual to claim those resources and transform those resources into one's private property. That is, unclaimed resources, these can be claimed by an individual and thereby it can be transformed into private property. There is nothing wrong, there is nothing immoral about it. The second principle of justice, according to Robert Nozick, is this, that is known as the principle of transfer. The principle of transfer means, according to Robert Nozick, that by virtue of a contract with another individual, if I acquire something, not of course through fraud, not of course through dishonest means, but simply with the help of or by virtue of a private contract, if I acquire something, that is, if someone's resources if someone's assets are transferred to me, then that becomes legitimately my private property, and there is nothing wrong, there is nothing immoral, there is nothing unethical about it. So one can guess that Robert Nozick's entire understanding is property oriented, and this is known as the typical manifestation of neoliberalism. Finally, we have to argue that liberalism, it has traveled a long path. It began with certain ideas, it began with certain principles, it was revised first in the form of neoliberalism, then by the end of the 1970s and beginning of the 1980s, it underwent a second revision, it became neoliberalism. But if somebody asks the question that what is the future of neoliberalism, then perhaps one has to raise a lot of uncomfortable questions. I'm not going into those details, but simply I would argue that if one looks at the world today, the kind of recession, the kind of crisis that Europe is facing, the world is facing, we have to remember that is primarily the result of these neoliberal policies which are being pursued by the major powers of the world. And neoliberalism, it has led to social unrest, it has led to crisis, it has led to recession, it is leading to agitations. So, what exactly is the future of neoliberalism? That question we of course have to examine, and we have to wait perhaps for a longer period to get the right answer, the exact answer to this question. Thank you.